in the 1960s when all this communist riots and stuff like that were going on. And I later did some research about my heritage, and I found out that my heritage from that farm in Ohio reaches all the way back to the gentlemen that came over, gentlemen and ladies that came over on the Mayflower. And I found out that I'm a direct descendant of William Bradford. Now, William Bradford, as some of you know, he came in on the Mayflower. He helped write the Mayflower Compact. He was governor of Massachusetts Colony for 30 years. And he was credited with inventing the free market system. He was also the first historian that this country knew. And he wrote a book called Of Plymouth Plantation. And I'd like to start my discussion today with a little bit from that book. You know, at every Thanksgiving, we're taught this story about the Pilgrims and how they came here to exploit the New World and, you know, push out the Indians and things like that. But if you read on Of Plymouth Plantation, the early parts of it talk about how they were trying to put this voyage together to come here for one specific reason, and that reason was to worship Jesus Christ freely. And they actually petitioned King James. You know, King James, the guy who commissioned the King James Bible, right? We would all think that he was a tremendous Christian man, but what he was doing was persecuting some of these people that had broken away from the Church of England. And so from Holland, where they had to go to avoid the persecution, they were petitioning the king through ambassadors and through political people that they had known, that if they got out of his hair completely and came to the New World, would they have the ability to worship freely as they saw fit? And it kept coming back, the answer is no. No, I won't give you that. And finally, after many attempts at this, at very high-level politics, he said, well, I'm not going to write it down that you will have religious freedom when you get there, but I will grant you this, that I won't harass you. So they got together and they said, okay, I think we're going to have to step out on faith on this and go anyway. And so that was the genesis of how these people decided that they would come here. So how were they going to get here? They didn't have any money. They'd been over in Holland. They were persecuted, and things were getting rough over there for them. So they signed an agreement with the Virginia Company, which was an organization that was trying to find out what was in this new world and exploit the resources from it and send it back so that they could get wealthy. The Virginia Company agreement that they had was like an indentured servant agreement. It was 7 years where they had to send all their proceeds back from the New World to England. And that included things like beaver skins or grain or whatever they might produce through the hard work of their hands. And in that agreement, there was like 15 points. And one of the points established a form of government that they were supposed to be under when they got here. And that form of government, the direct quote is that all such persons as are of this colony are to have their food, drink, clothing, and all provisions out of the common stock and goods of the said colony. What does that sound like? That's a communist form of government, right? Well, they felt like they had to agree to it, and they argued back and forth. There's letters in this book that show that they didn't like that provision, they didn't like certain things that were there, and they felt like it was counterproductive, but these guys were going to fund the trip, so they needed to go, and they decided to go do it. But one of the things that they agreed to as Christian men and women was for the protection of their general welfare. And this general welfare thing that I want to talk to you about today is very, very important, because it's how today's politicians are trying to justify this communist takeover of the United States through the healthcare system. They agreed among themselves to provide for the general welfare of one another. Here's a quote. We are knit together as a body in a most strict and sacred bond and covenant of the Lord, of the violation whereof we make great conscience, and by virtue whereof we we hold ourselves straightly tied to all care of each other's good. So they bonded together and they said, okay, whatever happens here, we as people together, we're going to provide for each other's good. We're going to take care of each other. We're going to look out for each other. Now, that didn't mean that if this guy was lazy over here and this guy was industrious over here, that the industrious guy was just going to give everything to the lazy guy. That is not what it meant. But if the lazy guy got sick or couldn't go to the fields, or his family was having a hard time or something, they might go and help him out of the goodness of their heart. And this theme of the general welfare was then again incorporated into their Constitution, their compact, the Mayflower Compact, which was the governing document of the colony. It said, and I know you've all read it, but I love to hear the words, so I'm going to read it to you again. In the name of God, amen. We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord King James, by the grace of God, of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, defender of the faith, etc. I guess they didn't want to list it all out. Having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith, in honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these present solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and of one another, covenant and combine ourselves into a civil body politic, for our better ordering and preservation, and the furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices, from time to time as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general use of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. See, this general welfare thing all the way through, but under the confines of some good government. And they had to keep the general welfare. Welfare is a hard thing for me to say. They were forced to do it. Think about this. You know, if you've ever tilled the soil or cleared a field or anything like that, they came to this new country where there wasn't anything going on. And all of a sudden they're thrown into this after a hard, hard journey in this small ship. And Bradford writes of the first real healthcare system of this new land. It says, of all the 100-odd persons, scarcely 50 remained, and sometimes 2 or 3 persons died in a day. In a time of worst distress, there were but 6 or 7 sound persons who, to their great commendation be it spoken, spared no pains night or day, but with great toil and at the risk of their own health, fetched wood, made fires, prepared food for the sick, made their beds, washed their infected clothes, dressed and undressed them. In a word, did all the homely and necessary services for them, which dainty and queasy stomachs cannot endure to hear mentioned. And all this they did willingly and cheerfully, without the least grudging, showing their love to the friends and brethren, a rare example and worthy to be remembered. And what I have said of these few, I should say of many others who died in this general visitation, and others yet living, that while they had health or strength, they forsook none that had need of them. Okay, this was a private endeavor. It was those people who cared for one another, and those who were in need receiving that blessing. And so this had to have been done a part of a communist kind of idea, because we know in communism the government would have done it, right? And they had already set up a different form here. Well, they survived that first winter, but as they went through the second, there were many problems. One of which was the way that they were set up to share everything equally with one another. This communist system of the Virginia Company Agreement. And what Bradford writes of this, he said, younger men objected to be forced to work for others without recompense. The resourceful man had no more share of food, clothes, etc. than the lazy man. Wives considered their work of cooking, mending, washing,